When a compassionate black man helps a distressed white woman on the side of the road, it seems like a simple act of kindness. But the next morning, a mysterious black SUV appears at his home, setting off a chain of events that will challenge his principles, test his strength, and change his life forever. How can one small decision ripple into something so much bigger? Let's find out. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, leave a like, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories full of twists and life-changing moments. Michael Carter was the kind of man everyone in Millhaven knew. At 36, Head carved out a simple but meaningful life. Working as a maintenance technician at the community center, he found purpose in fixing leaky faucets, mending broken doors, and organizing small events. People in town counted on him, and Michael wouldn't have had it any other way. One quiet evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Michael was driving home after a long day. The road was familiar, winding past open fields and scattered farmhouses, and the hum of his truck's engine soothed him. But as he rounded a bend, something unusual caught his eye: a sleek black sedan parked on the shoulder, its hazard lights flashing. He slowed down, squinting through the dim light. A woman stood beside the car, arms crossed and pacing nervously. Michael pulled over and rolled down his window. "Everything all right?" he called out. The woman turned to face him. Relief swept across her features, but her expression was tinged with embarrassment. "Not really," she admitted. "I've got a flat tire, and I don't know how to fix it. Could you help me?" Michael smiled as he stepped out of his truck. "Lucky for you. I've done this a time or two. Let's take a look." As he approached, he got a better look at her. She appeared to be in her late 20s, with blonde hair tied back in a loose ponytail. Her clothesa pencil skirt and fitted blouse looked professional, but were now slightly wrinkled, as if she had been wrestling with the problem for a while. "I'm Rachel," she said, her voice laced with nerves. "Rachel Evans. I'm new in town, just moved here for work." "Michael Carter," he replied as he crouched by the flat tire. "Welcome to Millhaven. We're small, but we're friendly." Rachel gave a faint smile. "That's what they told me. Guess I wasn't expecting my first night to go quite like this." Michael chuckled, reaching into her trunk for the spare tire. "You'd be surprised how often it happens on these roads. They're rough on tires. Lucky you didn't damage the rim." Rachel stayed by the side of the car, watching as Michael worked. The task was simple, but she seemed more nervous than the situation warranted. Her eyes darted to the darkening road, scanning the horizon as though expecting someone or something. "You all right?" Michael asked, glancing up. They greeted Michael with the same polished professionalism as before, but there was a subtle shift in their demeanor, less forceful, more accommodating. "We've reviewed your terms," Jonathan began, standing on Michael's porch, "and Mr. Evans is willing to proceed under your conditions. He respects your integrity, Mr. Carter, and sees value in your vision." Michael crossed his arms. "Good. Then let's talk specifics." Jonathan opened the folder, producing a series of documents. "Our proposal includes funding for a state-of-the-art community center here in Millhaven, complete with educational programs, recreational facilities, and support services. Additionally, we'll establish a scholarship fund for local students. Everything will be managed transparently, with you overseeing operations." Michael scanned the documents, noting the detailed plans and the generous budget. It was more than Head expected, almost too much. "And no strings attached?" he asked, his voice skeptical. "None," Jonathan assured him. "Mr. Evans simply asks for acknowledgement of his contribution. A plaque, perhaps. Nothing more." Michael hesitated, searching for any hidden trap, but the proposal seemed genuine, and the opportunity to give back to Millhaven was too important to ignore. "All right," he said, signing the agreement. "Let's make this happen." Jonathan smiled, his satisfaction barely veiled. "Excellent. Well, begin preparations immediately." As the men left, Michael felt a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. Head won the first round, setting his terms and maintaining his principles. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that dealing with Charles Evans would be more complicated than it seemed. True to their word, the Evans team moved quickly. Within weeks, construction on the Millhaven Community Center began. Architects, engineers, and workers flooded the small town, drawing curious stares from locals and used to such large-scale projects. Michael was at the center of it all, working closely with the project leaders to ensure the center reflected the town's needs. He organized community meetings, gathering input from residents about what they wanted: a gym for kids, classrooms for adult education, and spaces for community events. The scholarship fund also gained traction, with applications pouring in from young students eager for a chance at higher education. For the first time, Millhaven felt alive with possibility. The community rallied behind the project, but not without its skeptics. Some whispered that Michael had sold out, that the Evans family's involvement came with unseen costs. Others wondered why a billionaire from the city cared so much about their small town. Michael brushed off the rumors, focusing on the work. But as the weeks turned into months, he noticed subtle reminders of the Evans family's influence. One afternoon, as Michael reviewed blueprints with the project manager, Jonathan arrived unexpectedly. "We're impressed with your progress," Jonathan said smoothly, but there was an edge to his tone. "However, Mr. Evans has requested periodic updates on the center's operations. It's standard procedure." Michael frowned. "Updates? I thought this was my project to oversee." "It is," Jonathan assured him, "but transparency goes both ways. Mr. Evans wants to ensure his investment is being handled properly." Michael bit back a retort, nodding stiffly. "Fine, but I'm running things my way. I won't have anyone interfering." Jonathan smiled, but the look in his eyes was calculating. "Of course. We wouldn't dream of stepping on your toes." As Jonathan left, Michael felt the first cracks in the arrangement. Had known accepting help from Charles Evans came with risks, but he hadn't expected oversight so soon. He resolved to stay vigilant. This was his community's project, and he wouldn't let anyone, including the Evans family, undermine its purpose. The Millhaven Community Center was nearing completion, and excitement buzzed through the town. Construction crews worked tirelessly to finish the final details, and locals frequently stopped by to marvel at the state-of-the-art building rising from the once empty lot. For Michael, the satisfaction of seeing his vision take shape was tempered by a growing unease. The Evans family's involvement, while generous, had started to feel less like support and more like quiet surveillance. Jonathan Hayes' periodic updates became regular visits, each one accompanied by subtle reminders of the Evans family's influence. "Mr. Evans appreciates your leadership," Jonathan said one afternoon as he inspected the nearly completed gymnasium. "He's been following your progress closely." Michael bristled. "I didn't realize I was under such close scrutiny." Jonathan's practiced smile didn't waver. "It's not scrutiny, Mr. Carter. It's admiration. You've done remarkable work here." But Michael wasn't convinced. The visits, the veiled compliments, the quiet pressure, it all felt like a leash slowly tightening. That unease grew when Michael received an unexpected call from Rachel. "We need to talk," she said, her tone urgent. Privately, they met that evening at the edge of Millhaven's park, far from prying eyes and ears. Rachel looked tired, as if the weight of her family's legacy had finally worn her down. "Something's changed," she began. "My father's been talking about you more than usual. He likes what you've done with the center, but he's also wondering how far you'll go." Michael frowned. "What does that mean?" Rachel hesitated, then lowered her voice. "It means he's testing you, Michael. He sees this as a stepping stone, a way to see if you're useful in other ways." Michael's chest tightened. "I told him my terms. This project is for the community, not for him." "I know," Rachel said, her expression pained. "But my father doesn't see it that way. To him, everyone has a price. And if he can't buy you, he'll find other ways to motivate you." Michael stared at her, his mind racing. "Are you saying he's going to come after me?" Rachel shook her head. "Not directly, but he'll make it harder for you to say no in the future. You're not just a small-town hero to him anymore, Michael. You're a potential asset or a liability." Michael felt the weight of her words like a stone in his gut. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you deserve to know what you're up against," Rachel replied. "And because I owe you." For a moment, the two stood in silence, the distant hum of crickets filling the night air. Finally, Michael nodded. "Thanks for the warning. I'll handle it." Rachel studied him, her expression both worried and admiring. "I hope you can. Just be careful." My father doesn't lose. The next time Jonathan arrived, Michael was ready. The two stood in the newly finished community center's library, surrounded by shelves waiting to be filled with books. Jonathan was as polished as ever, his briefcase resting on the table between them. I'm here to discuss the next phase of our partnership, Jonathan began, his tone warm but firm. Michael crossed his arms. There is no next phase. The deal was for this center and the scholarships. Nothing more. Jonathan raised an eyebrow. Surely you don't think Mr. Evans' generosity ends here. He sees potential in expanding this model to other communities under your leadership. Michael shook his head. I'm not interested. I'm here for Millhaven, not to be part of some empire. Jonathan's smile thinned. You're turning down an opportunity to change lives on a much larger scale. Why? Because I don't trust your boss, Michael shot back. This isn't about helping people, it's about control. And I won't be a part of that. Jonathan's expression hardened. Careful, Mr. Carter. Rejecting Mr. Evans' offer once was one thing. Rejecting it twice could have consequences. Michael stepped closer, his voice low and steady. Let me make this clear. Millhaven doesn't belong to the Evans family. If you want to help, fine. But if you try to strong-arm me, you'll regret it. For a moment, the two men stared each other down, the air between them charged with tension. Then Jonathan picked up his briefcase, his expression unreadable. I'll relay your message, he said curtly before walking out. As the SUV drove away, Michael stood alone in the library, his heart pounding. He knew he'd just drawn a line in the sand and that Charles Evans wouldn't take it lightly. In the days following Michael's confrontation with Jonathan Hayes, an eerie calm settled over Millhaven. The community center was finally complete, and the grand opening ceremony was just days away. Locals buzzed with excitement, eager to see the new facility that promised to transform their small town. But Michael couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing beneath the surface. Jonathan's parting words lingered in his mind. Rejecting it twice could have consequences. The first sign of trouble came when the town's construction inspector arrived unexpectedly. Michael had dealt with Inspector Bailey before, a no-nonsense man who prided himself on keeping projects in compliance. But this time, Bailey's demeanor was unusually strict. I'm here to reevaluate the community center, Bailey announced as he walked into Michael's office. We've received complaints about structural issues. Michael frowned. Complaints? From who? Bailey avoided his gaze. Can't say. Anonymous. Michael escorted Bailey through the building, pointing out the rigorous inspections already conducted during construction. We've followed every regulation to the letter, Michael said firmly. Bailey grunted but seemed unconvinced. As the inspection dragged on, Michael's frustration grew. He couldn't prove it, but he suspected this was no coincidence. When Bailey finally left, muttering something about needing to review his notes, Michael stood in the empty gymnasium, his hands clenched into fists. The Evans family was behind T. She was sure of it. The next blow came in the form of rumors spreading through town. Whispers about Michael's supposed deal with the Evans family painted him as a sellout, someone who had traded Millhaven's integrity for a shiny new building. People are starting to talk, said Derek, one of Michael's childhood friends, as they sat on the porch of Michael's home. They're saying you're in bed with some big-shot billionaire, that this center isn't really for you, it's for them. Michael felt a sharp pang of betrayal. He'd poured his heart into this project, ensuring every decision reflected the community's needs. You don't believe that, do you? He asked, his voice tight. Of course not, Derek said quickly. But you know how people are. They see something shiny and new, and they assume there's a catch. Michael sighed, running a hand through his hair. This is exactly what they want. They're trying to turn people against me. Derek frowned. Who's they? Michael hesitated, then leaned in. The Evans family. They've been pushing me to take their help on their terms, and I've refused. It's retaliation. Derek whistled low. That's some serious stuff, man. What are you gonna do? Michael stared out at the quiet street, determination hardening in his chest. I'm going to keep fighting. This center isn't about them, it's about Millhaven, and I won't let anyone take that away from us. On the day of the grand opening, Michael arrived early, the morning air crisp and filled with anticipation. The community center gleamed in the sunlight, its polished exterior a symbol of hope for the town. Locals began to gather, their murmured conversations blending into a low hum of excitement. Kids ran across the freshly paved courtyard, their laughter echoing off the building's walls. Michael stood near the entrance, greeting familiar faces and shaking hands. Despite the tension of the past few weeks, he felt a flicker of pride. This was why he had fought so hard for these people, for this moment. But as the ceremony began, his unease returned. Jonathan Hayes was there, standing at the back of the crowd with his usual unreadable expression. He hadn't announced his presence, but Michael had spotted him immediately. Rachel arrived shortly after, slipping through the crowd to stand beside Michael. "He's watching," she whispered, nodding toward Jonathan. "I know," Michael muttered. The mayor stepped up to the podium to deliver a short speech, followed by a ribbon-cutting ceremony. As the ribbon fell and the crowd applauded, Michael's mind churned. He knew this wasn't the end, it was only the beginning. The grand opening of the Millhaven Community Center was, by all outward appearances, a resounding success. Locals marveled at the facility. Children darted between the shiny new classrooms, and parents spoke excitedly about the programs that would soon begin. But Michael's focus wasn't on the festivities. His eyes kept drifting to Jonathan Hayes, who stood at the edge of the crowd like a shadow. Rachel's whispered warnings replayed in his mind, a reminder that Charles Evans wouldn't simply fade into the background. When the crowd began to thin, Jonathan finally made his move. He approached Michael near the entrance, his steps slow and deliberate. "Congratulations, Mr. Carter," Jonathan said, his tone smooth. "It's a remarkable achievement." Michael crossed his arms. "If you're here to cause trouble, you're wasting your time." Jonathan raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a faint smile. "On the contrary, I'm here to support you. Mr. Evans is very pleased with what you've accomplished. He sees potential." "There's that word again," Michael said, his voice laced with irritation. Jonathan chuckled softly. "You're a man of principle, Michael, and that's admirable. But let me be clear, Mr. Evans is not a man who accepts limits. This community center is just the beginning." Michael stepped closer, his voice low and firm. "I don't work for your boss. This place belongs to Millhaven, not to him. And if he wants to push me, he's going to find out just how stubborn I can be." Jonathan's smile didn't waver, but his eyes hardened. "I'd advise caution, Mr. Carter. Principles are admirable, but they're rarely profitable. And in Mr. Evans' world, profitability is what matters most." With that, Jonathan turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. As the weeks passed, the initial excitement around the community center began to fade, replaced by whispers of suspicion. Michael overheard murmurs at the local diner, conversations laced with doubt about his intentions and the Evans family's involvement. "Did you hear about Carter?" one man muttered to another over coffee. "He's in deep with those city types. Bet they're just using us for something." Michael clenched his jaw, but said nothing. Confronting rumors would only fuel them. But it wasn't just the town's trust that was eroding. Michael began noticing subtle roadblocks appearing in the center's operations. Supplies for new programs arrived late, funding for maintenance was delayed, and permits for expansion were suddenly under review. It was clear to Michael that Charles Evans was behind it. The man wasn't coming at him directly, he was chipping away at the center's foundation, trying to remind Michael who held the real power. Michael decided he needed to act. If Evans wanted to play games, he'd show the town exactly who he was fighting for. At the next town meeting, Michael took the floor. The room was packed with locals, their faces a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Michael could feel the weight of their doubts, but he pushed forward, his voice steady. "I know there have been questions about the community center," he began. "Some of you wonder why it was built, who funded it, and what strings might be attached. So let me set the record straight." The room fell silent. "This center exists because Millhaven deserves better," Michael said. "Better opportunities, better resources, and better futures for our kids. Yes, Charles Evans provided the funding, but only because I made it clear this place would serve our town, not his agenda. And he'll fight to keep it that way." A murmur rippled through the crowd. "Everything we've built here belongs to us," Michael continued. "And if anyone tries to take it away, they'll have to go through me." The room erupted in applause. Michael's words were more than a defense, they were a promise. And as he stood before the crowd, he realized he wasn't fighting alone. The applause from the town meeting still echoed in Michael's mind as he walked home that night, the crisp air carrying a renewed sense of purpose. But deep down, he knew Charles Evans wouldn't let this challenge go unanswered. Sure enough, the very next morning, a sleek black car, no, the usual SUV, pulled up in front of the community center. This time, it wasn't Jonathan Hayes who stepped out. It was Charles Evans himself. Michael watched from the office window as the older man approached, his tailored suit and commanding presence making it clear he wasn't here for pleasantries. When Charles entered the office, he wasted no time. "Michael Carter," he said, his voice smooth but firm. "You've made quite a name for yourself." Michael met his gaze evenly. "And I'm guessing you're here to change that." Charles chuckled, though there was no humor in it. "Let's not waste time with games. You've done a fine job with the center, but you seem to have forgotten something. None of this happens without me." Michael leaned back in his chair, his expression calm. "I didn't forget, but I also remember our deal. This place belongs to Millhaven." Charles' smile faded. "You're an idealist, Michael. That's admirable, but it's also dangerous. The world doesn't run on ideals. It runs on power and control. And right now, you're standing in the way of both." Michael stood, his voice firm. "I'm standing for this community. You think your money gives you control, but not here. Not with me." For a moment, the two men stared each other down, the tension thick enough to cut. Finally, Charles sighed, shaking his head. "You're a stubborn man, Carter. That's going to cost you." He turned to leave, but paused at the door. "I'll give you one last chance. Work with me, and this town will thrive. Fight me, and it'll crumble." Michael didn't flinch. "Do your worst." Charles left without another word, and as the car disappeared down the street, Michael felt the weight of what had just done. Head stood up to one of the most powerful men had ever met, but he also knew the battle was far from over. Charles Evans' retaliation came swiftly. A series of anonymous complaints led to sudden audits of the community center's operations, and local officials began questioning permits and funding. Supplies were delayed indefinitely, and rumors about Michael's leadership resurfaced with new venom. It felt like a coordinated attack, and Michael knew he couldn't fight it alone. That's when the town surprised him. At the next community meeting, residents who had once been skeptical of the center began to speak out in its defense. Parents praised the programs that were helping their kids. Local business owners shared how the center had brought new energy to Millhaven. Even students came forward, talking about the scholarships that had given them hope for the future. One by one, the voices of Millhaven drowned out the doubts. Michael stood at the back of the room, overwhelmed by the outpouring of support. It wasn't just his fight, Anna Marie, it was theirs. Weeks later, Michael received an envelope in the mail. It contained a simple letter from Jonathan Hayes. "Mr. Carter, Mr. Evans has decided to withdraw his involvement from Millhaven. The center is yours to manage as you see fit. Consider this a gesture of goodwill. Best regards, Jonathan Hayes." Michael read the letter twice, disbelief giving way to cautious relief. He didn't trust Charles Evans' sudden change of heart, but it didn't matter. The center was safe, and Millhaven had won. Months turned into years, and the Millhaven Community Center became a cornerstone of the town. It provided education, recreation, and hope for generations, standing as a testament to what could be achieved when people worked together. Michael remained at the heart of it all, his quiet leadership inspiring others to take pride in their town. He never forgot the battle it had taken to get there, or the people who had stood by him when it mattered most. One evening, as Michael locked up the center for the night, he spotted Rachel standing by the entrance. "You did it," she said with a smile. "We did it," Michael corrected, his gaze sweeping over the building. Rachel nodded, her expression thoughtful. "My father doesn't lose often, but with you, I think he finally met someone who could stand their ground." Michael chuckled softly. "It wasn't just me. This place belongs to all of us." As they stood in the fading light, the future felt brighter than ever. Millhaven was more than a town, no, it was a community, united by the strength of its people and a leader who refused to give up. "What did you think of his story?" Let us know in the comments below. And if this tale of unexpected twists inspired you, be sure to leave a like and subscribe for more stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Yeah, Rachel said quickly. Just it's late, and I don't like being out here alone. Fair enough, Michael said, tightening the last lug nut. You're good to go now, but make sure you get this fixed soon. These spares aren't built for long trips. Rachel exhaled, a wave of gratitude washing over her. Thank you so much. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't stopped. Michael straightened and wiped his hands on a rag he had brought from his truck. Not a problem. Just glad I could help. Reaching into her purse, Rachel pulled out a small stack of bills. Please take this. It's the least I can do. Michael shook his head firmly. Keep it. Helping someone in need is its own reward. Rachel hesitated, clearly surprised by his refusal. You're sure? Positive, Michael said with a warm smile. Drive safe now. Rachel climbed back into her car, hesitating for a moment before starting the engine. As she drove off, she gave him a small wave through the window, her face a mixture of relief and something harder to read, gratitude, perhaps, but tinged with unease. Michael watched her car disappear into the distance, then climbed back into his truck. As he drove home, he thought little of the encounter. For him, it was just another good deed, one of countless small acts of kindness he had performed over the years. But as the glow of his porch light came into view, Michael found himself replaying the moment in his mind, the way Rachel had kept glancing over her shoulder, the tension in her voice. He shook it off as exhaustion from the day. After all, everyone had their worries. Little did he know, that single act of kindness would set off a chain of events that would change his life forever. The morning started like any other. Michael Carter sipped his coffee on the front porch of his modest home, the sun peeking through the trees that lined his quiet street. Birds chirped in the crisp air, and a light breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass. Michael liked these moments of calm before heading to work. They gave him a chance to clear his mind and prepare for the day ahead. Today, however, something broke the familiar routine. A sleek black SUV parked across the street. At first, Michael thought little of it. Maybe a neighbor had a visitor, or someone had pulled over to make a call. But as he glanced at the car between sips of coffee, he noticed that it hadn't moved in over an hour. The vehicle stood out in Millhaven. Its polished, high-end design clashed with the older, practical cars that locals drove. Its tinted windows offered no hint of who was inside, and the sheer stillness of it felt off. Michael tried to shrug it off, but a flicker of unease settled in his chest. He got ready for work, hoping the SUV would be gone by the time he left. It wasn't. As Michael backed out of his driveway, the SUV remained parked in the exact same spot. He glanced at it in his rearview mirror as he drove away, but nothing changed. No movement, no sign of life inside. By the time Michael returned home that evening, the SUV was gone. Relief washed over him as he parked his truck and stepped inside. Maybe it had been a delivery driver or someone visiting a neighbor. He told himself it didn't matter. But the next morning, it was back. This time, Michael couldn't ignore it. The SUV was parked on the same stretch of street, as if waiting for something or someone. Determined to get a closer look, Michael walked across the street with what he hoped was casual confidence. As he approached, he noted how pristine the vehicle was, its glossy black paint reflecting the morning sunlight. The windows were so darkly tinted that they appeared like mirrors. When he was only a few feet away, the engine suddenly roared to life, startling him. The SUV peeled away, tires screeching as it sped down the street and disappeared around a corner. Michael stood frozen for a moment, his pulse quickening. Whoever was in that car didn't want to be seen. The encounter left him rattled. Michael prided himself on being level-headed, but this felt different. It was one thing to notice a strange car in the neighborhood, but to have it speed away the moment he got close, that wasn't normal. The SUV returned a third time the following morning. This time, it didn't stay long. Shortly after Michael noticed it, two men stepped out of the vehicle and approached his house. They were sharply dressed in tailored suits, their polished shoes clicking against the pavement. Michael watched them from his porch, his coffee cup suspended halfway to his lips. He set it down and stood, his gut telling him this was no ordinary visit. "Mr. Carter?" one of the men called out, his tone professional but firm. "That's me," Michael replied, crossing his arms. "And you are?" The man closest to him extended a hand, a practiced smile on his face. "Jonathan Hayes. My associate, Daniel Reed." Michael didn't take the offered hand. "What can I do for you?" Jonathan's smile didn't falter, but there was a coolness in his eyes. "We're here on behalf of Charles Evans. You may remember assisting his daughter, Rachel, a few nights ago." Michael blinked, surprised. "Rachel Evans? I helped her change a tire. Is she okay?" Jonathan nodded. "She's fine, thanks to you. Mr. Evans is a man who values loyalty, and he was very moved by your act of kindness. He'd like to show his gratitude." Michael frowned. "That's not necessary. I didn't do it expecting anything in return, which is precisely why he's so interested in helping you," Jonathan said smoothly. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, embossed card. "If there's anything you need, money, housing, employment, just call this number. The Evans family has the means to make it happen." Michael stared at the card but didn't take it. "I appreciate the offer, but am fine where I am." Jonathan's smile thinned. "Take your time to consider it, Mr. Carter. Opportunities like this don't come often." Michael hesitated, then reluctantly took the card. "I'll think about it. That's all we ask," Jonathan said. He and Daniel turned and walked back to the SUV, their movements deliberate and measured. Michael watched as the SUV drove away, his unease deepening. Something about the encounter felt wrong. These men weren't just being polite or generous. They had an agenda, and Michael suspected he wasn't going to like it. He slipped the card into his pocket and went back inside, hoping he'd never have to use it. But deep down, he knew this wasn't the end of it. Michael had barely finished his dinner that evening when there was a knock at his door. The sound startled him. Unannounced visitors were rare in Millhaven, especially at night. Wiping his hands on a kitchen towel, he made his way to the door and opened it cautiously. Standing on the porch was Rachel Evans. She looked different from the nervous woman he'd met on the roadside days ago. Her blonde hair was down, framing a face etched with tension. She wore a casual sweater and jeans, but her presence carried the weight of urgency. "Rachel?" Michael asked, surprised. "Can you come in?" she asked softly, glancing over her shoulder. "I don't think it's safe to talk out here." Her words set Michael's nerves on edge, but he stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. Once inside, she seemed to relax slightly, though her eyes still darted to the windows as if she expected someone to appear. "What's going on?" Michael asked. "Those men, Jonathan and Daniel, said your father wanted to thank me. Now you're here, looking like someone's chasing you." Rachel hesitated, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Michael, I owe you an explanation. What happened that night, it wasn't just about a flat tire." Michael leaned against the edge of the kitchen counter, his arms crossed. "I figured as much." Rachel sighed, the weight of her thoughts visibly pressing down on her. "My father, Charles Evans, isn't just wealthy, he's powerful. His business dealings have made him a lot of enemies. The kind of people who don't play by the rules." Michael's expression darkened. "Enemies?" Rachel nodded. "That night, I was on my way home from a meeting in the city. I didn't realize it until too late, but someone was following me. They were trying to force me off the road when my tire blew. I barely got away." Michael stared at her, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to fall into place. "So, when I stopped to help you, you probably scared them off," Rachel said, her voice low. "They didn't want to risk being seen. That's why I was so nervous. It wasn't just the flat tire. I was terrified they'd come back." Michael exhaled sharply, the memory of her uneasy glances making more sense now. "And your father? He sent those men because he thinks him." "What involved?" Rachel shook her head quickly. "No, not involved. But my father, he has a way of turning things to his advantage. He probably sees you as someone who can be useful." Michael frowned. "Useful how?" Rachel hesitated, as though weighing her next words carefully. "My father rewards loyalty, but he also expects something in return. Those men who visited you, they weren't just offering a gift. They were extending a kind of invitation. To what? Michael asked, his voice laced with suspicion. Rachel's gaze dropped to the floor. To become part of his circle. To owe him something. Michael felt a chill run down his spine. He pulled the embossed card from his pocket and stared at it. So, if I call this number, you'd be putting yourself in his debt, Rachel finished. And trust me, Michael, that's not a place you want to be. The room fell silent as Michael absorbed her words. He thought back to the two men in suits, their polished smiles and carefully chosen words. There had been something predatory in their politeness, a sense of power they hadn't needed to flaunt. Why are you telling me this? He asked finally. Rachel met his eyes, her expression earnest. Because you helped me when you didn't have to. You could have driven by, but you didn't. I can't let my father pull you into something you don't understand, not after what you did for me. Michael's jaw tightened. What am I supposed to do then? Just ignore it? Hope your father loses interest? Rachel hesitated, then stepped closer. I don't know. But whatever you decide, be careful. My father doesn't take no for an answer easily. Her words hung heavy in the air. Michael nodded slowly, his thoughts racing. All right. Thanks for warning me. Rachel offered a faint smile. I owe you that much. She turned to leave, pausing at the door. Michael, if you ever feel like you're in over your head, call me. I'll do what I can to help. Michael didn't respond as she stepped out into the night, but he stood at the window, watching until her car disappeared down the road. For the first time, Michael realized his simple act of kindness had entangled him in something far more dangerous than had imagined. And though he wasn't sure what would come next, he knew one thing for certain: the Evans family wasn't finished with him yet. The next morning, Michael awoke with a sense of unease that settled deep in his chest. Rachel's warning had replayed in his mind throughout the night, her words laced with both gratitude and fear. The black SUV, the men in suits, and the gold-embossed card, it all painted a picture of a world far removed from the quiet life had built in Millhaven. Sitting at his kitchen table with a steaming cup of coffee, he stared at the card Jonathan Hayes had given him. The number gleamed under the sunlight streaming through the window, almost mocking him with its simplicity. A single call could connect him to a world of wealth and power, but at what cost? Michael shook his head, sliding the card into a drawer. Not my world, he muttered to himself. The day passed as uneventfully as it could. Michael immersed himself in work at the community center, fixing broken chairs, helping set up for an after-school program, and chatting with the regulars who passed through. But even in the middle of the bustle, the thought lingered. What if Charles Evans didn't take no for an answer? What if Rachel's warning had been more of a prediction than a possibility? That evening, Michael's fears were validated. He was sitting on his porch, enjoying the cool night air, when the sound of an approaching vehicle drew his attention. He tensed as a familiar black SUV rolled to a stop in front of his house. The door opened, and Jonathan Hayes stepped out, alone this time. His tailored suit was as sharp as ever, and his expression was as unreadable as a blank page. Michael stood, his jaw tightening. What now? Jonathan approached the porch slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. Good evening, Mr. Carter. I hope I'm not disturbing you. You are, Michael said bluntly. Jonathan's practiced smile flickered, but he recovered quickly. It'll be brief, then. Mr. Evans has asked me to deliver a message. He admires your integrity, but he believes you may be underestimating the value of what's being offered. Michael crossed his arms. I'm not interested. I told you that already. Jonathan nodded, as if he had expected the response. Understandable, but perhaps it would help to clarify what's at stake. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thin folder, offering it to Michael. Michael hesitated before taking it. He opened the folder to find a stack of documents, each bearing his name. Bills, financial records, and even a notice of overdue property taxes he hadn't realized had gone unpaid. What is this? Michael demanded, his voice sharp. Just a small demonstration of Mr. Evans' resources, Jonathan replied smoothly. Imagine what could be achieved with his support, not just for you, but for this community. The repairs this town desperately needs, the opportunities it could create for future generations, all within reach. Michael felt his stomach twist. There was an unmistakable threat buried beneath Jonathan's polished words, a reminder that Charles Evans could not only offer him a way out, but also make life far more difficult if he refused. "I don't need his help," Michael said, closing the folder and shoving it back at Jonathan. Jonathan didn't take it. "Think carefully, Mr. Carter. Mr. Evans doesn't extend offers like this lightly. Declining it would be unwise." Michael glared at him, his frustration boiling over. "I'm not for sale. Tell him that." Jonathan's expression hardened for the first time. "Very well. But understand this, Mr. Evans is a patient man, but his patience isn't limitless." With that, Jonathan turned and walked back to the SUV. As the vehicle pulled away, Michael stood on the porch, his hands clenched into fists. For the first time, he felt the weight of what he was truly up against. Michael didn't sleep much that night. Jonathan Hayes' words played on a loop in his mind, their underlying menace growing heavier with each repetition. He knew that ignoring Charles Evans wasn't an option anymore. Refusing his offer was one thing, but outright defiance? That felt like inviting trouble into his life and possibly his community. The next morning, Michael decided to take Rachel up on her offer of help. After searching through his phone for the number she had left him, he made the call. It rang twice before Rachel's voice came through, breathless but alert. "Michael?" she asked, a note of surprise in her tone. "Yeah," he replied. "We need to talk." "In person." Rachel hesitated for only a moment. "All right. Where?" An hour later, Michael met Rachel at a small cafe on the outskirts of town. She arrived looking cautious, her gaze scanning the parking lot before she slid into the booth across from him. "What happened?" she asked, leaning in. Michael didn't bother with pleasantries. "Your father's people came by again. They're not taking no for an answer." He pulled the folder Jonathan had left and set it on the table. "They even dug up my financial records. It's not just an offer anymore, it's pressure." Rachel opened the folder and skimmed through the papers, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I was afraid of this," she murmured. "My father doesn't handle rejection well. He sees obstacles as challenges to be managed." Michael narrowed his eyes. "Managed? Feels more like intimidation to me." Rachel sighed, setting the folder down. "I warned you, Michael. Once you're on his radar, he won't stop until he gets what he wants." Michael leaned back in his seat, frustration simmering beneath his calm exterior. "Then tell me how to get off his radar. You know him better than anyone." Rachel hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of her coffee cup. "The truth is you don't. My father isn't used to people walking away from him. The more you push back, the more he'll push forward." "Great," Michael muttered, rubbing a hand over his face. But Rachel continued, "There's a way to handle this without losing yourself in the process." Michael's eyes narrowed. "I'm listening." Rachel leaned closer, her voice lowering. "Accept the offer, but on your terms, not his. Make it clear that you're not a pawn for him to manipulate. Use what he's offering to help the community, not yourself. That's something even my father would respect. He values strength and independence, even if he doesn't say it outright." Michael considered her words, the idea settling uneasily in his mind. "You think he'd go for that? Me setting conditions?" Rachel nodded. "He might grumble, but yes. My father doesn't trust people who take his money blindly. If you show him you're principled, that you're not afraid to stand your ground, he'll respect you, and he'll back off at least a little." Michael sat back, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He'd spent his life avoiding entanglements like this, priding himself on his independence. But Rachel was right if he framed it as an opportunity to uplift his community. It might be worth it. Finally, he nodded. "All right. He'll do it, but only if every cent goes toward building something meaningful for Millhaven. Nothing for me." Rachel smiled faintly, relief softening her expression. "You're doing the right thing, Michael. And if you need help navigating this, he'll be here." He gave her a small nod, the tension in his chest easing slightly. But as they finished their coffee and parted ways, a new thought gnawed at him. If he was walking into Charles Avant's world, could he truly dictate the terms? The following day, Michael made the call. His hands were steady, but his voice carried the weight of reluctant determination. "I've thought about your offer," he told Jonathan Hayes, who answered after the first ring. "If Mr. Evans is serious about helping, he'll accept, but only if the resources go directly toward the town, Not me personally. There was a pause on the other end, followed by Jonathan's measured tone. I'll convey your terms to Mr. Evans. I'm sure he'll find them intriguing. I'm not negotiating, Michael said firmly. If he doesn't like it, the answer's no. Jonathan chuckled softly. Understood. I'll be in touch. 2 days later, the black SUV returned. Jonathan stepped out, folder in hand, accompanied by Daniel Reed. They greeted Michael with the same polished professionalism as before, but there was a subtle shift in their demeanor, less forceful, more accommodating. We've reviewed your terms, Jonathan began, standing on Michael's porch, and Mr. Evans is willing to proceed under your conditions. He respects your integrity, Mr. Carter, and sees value in your vision. Michael crossed his arms. Good. Then let's talk specifics. Jonathan opened the folder, producing a series of documents. Our proposal includes funding for a state-of-the-art community center here in Millhaven, complete with educational programs, recreational facilities, and support services. Additionally, we'll establish a scholarship fund for local students. Everything will be managed transparently, with you overseeing operations. Michael scanned the documents, noting the detailed plans and the generous budget. It was more than he'd expected, almost too much. And no strings attached? He asked, his voice skeptical. None, Jonathan assured him. Mr. Evans simply asks for acknowledgement of his contribution. A plaque, perhaps. Nothing more. Michael hesitated, searching for any hidden trap, but the proposal seemed genuine, and the opportunity to give back to Millhaven was too important to ignore. All right, he said, signing the agreement. Let's make this happen. Jonathan smiled, his satisfaction barely veiled. Excellent. We'll begin preparations immediately. As the men left, Michael felt a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. He'd won the first round, setting his terms and maintaining his principles. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that dealing with Charles Evans would be more complicated than it seemed. True to their word, the Evans team moved quickly. Within weeks, construction on the Millhaven Community Center began. Architects, engineers, and workers flooded the small town, drawing curious stares from locals and used to such large-scale projects. Michael was at the center of it all, working closely with the project leaders to ensure the center reflected the town's needs. He organized community meetings, gathering input from residents about what they wanted: a gym for kids, classrooms for adult education, and spaces for community events. The scholarship fund also gained traction, with applications pouring in from young students eager for a chance at higher education. For the first time, Millhaven felt alive with possibility. The community rallied behind the project, but not without its skeptics. Some whispered that Michael had sold out, that the Evans family's involvement came with unseen costs. Others wondered why a billionaire from the city cared so much about their small town. Michael brushed off the rumors, focusing on the work. But as the weeks turned into months, he noticed subtle reminders of the Evans family's influence. The following day, Michael made the call. His hands were steady, but his voice carried the weight of reluctant determination. I've thought about your offer, he told Jonathan Hayes, who answered after the first ring. If Mr. Evans is serious about helping, he'll accept, but only if the resources go directly toward the town. Not me personally. There was a pause on the other end, followed by Jonathan's measured tone. I'll convey your terms to Mr. Evans. I'm sure he'll find them intriguing. I'm not negotiating, Michael said firmly. If he doesn't like it, the answer's no. Jonathan chuckled softly. Understood. I'll be in touch. 2 days later, the black SUV returned. Jonathan stepped out, folder in hand, accompanied by Daniel Reed.